Welcome to the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. I'm your host, Simone Morris, and I have a passion for empowering others to take responsibility for their careers. Yes, I've written several books on owning your career and am loving hosting this podcast. This podcast is for you if you're willing to make a shift to the driver's seat in your career. We feature leaders who inspire, empower, and motivate you for consistent career action for results. Please continue to join us every Sunday when a new episode is released. Let's get into this week's show. Welcome to this week's episode of the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. This week, I'm delighted to welcome to the show Rebecca Wilson. Rebecca is Managing Director of 2020 Foresight Executive Search and its sister company, 2020 Foresight Executive Marketing. She heads up the New York office and covers searches nationwide. She brings more than 25 years of operational marketing and strategic consulting experience to her executive search practice. Her search expertise includes real estate, private equity, and financial services. She is a board member of the Women's Business Development Council. She earned her bachelor's degree in English and Italian from the State University of New York at Stony Brook and a master's of business administration from the University of Virginia's Darden School. She studied in Siena, Italy, and is fluent in Italian. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca to the podcast. Rebecca, it's so nice to have you join the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Same to you.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about what you're currently doing. I read your bio, very impressive, but tell us about what you do in your day-to-day.
So right now I am an executive recruiter with a company called 2020 Foresight Executive Search. So that means that companies engage us to fill specific roles. They tend to be more senior roles, but if existing clients want us to fill mid-level and junior level searches, we do that as well. I would say the lion's share of our searches are in the United States. We do some work for international companies that want to expand into the United States. And we are a retained search firm. That means we work exclusively with our clients on those searches. And the industry specialties are real estate, private equity, and financial services.
Got you. So how did you get there? What was your path to the seat you currently sit in?
Sort of a winding path. In my career, I started off before going back to grad school, interestingly, working for Alitalia Airlines. Realized very quickly that I was missing a lot of the core business skills necessary for the roles I wanted because I had studied English and Italian literature in my undergraduate. And, at the time, those sorts of liberal arts degrees were quite common. You sort of studied what you liked to study, and then you figured it out later. Nowadays, a lot of students are starting off with very specific goals in mind. At the time, we just studied what we wanted. So went back to business school. Then I ended up in financial services for the next chunk of my career. Then I followed my then husband to Canada and then Australia. Because of that, I did my own consulting for about 8 years. Then when I returned to the United States, I had 2 relatively young children, and I was actually going through a divorce. And so I said, okay, can I go back to the investment banking world? 70 hours a week, long commute to the city. I said, that's not realistic. So I decided to pivot to executive search at the time. Many people over the years had said to me, you'd be great, you should consider it. I didn't want to when I was doing my other sort of work. And then one of my clients, interestingly, in Australia, one of my consulting clients, had some executive search needs. She had me do a business case for her business. She was a learning and development company. So they were constantly in touch with human resources professionals who would ask them, hey, can you help us out with the search? So we did a business plan. She launched that business. And in a pinch, I helped her out a couple of times on some searches. And I thought, wow, this is actually very interesting, very engaging, very fun in many ways. So when I got back to the US, I explored that and then transitioned. And that's where I've been since 2016.
Wow, how exciting. So going back to your undergraduate and the English and Italian, like what was in your head of what you would do with that?
I had thought perhaps law school.
Oh,
I come from a family where my mother was an Italian immigrant. She never got to go to college, and she said to my brother, sister, and I don't care what you do, but you're not allowed to talk to me until you get your undergraduate degree. Okay. My father grew up on a farm in Kentucky and ended up becoming an aerospace engineer. So they both believed in education, but neither one was in a traditional business world where they could really give my brother and sister and I a lot of advice. So I thought, okay, I want to do at least as well, if not better than my parents, like most kids do. And I didn't really know because I didn't have a lot of examples in my life. And so I thought, okay, let me start with something I like. Law school could be fun. And then eventually I took the LSATs and I decided I didn't even actually love doing the LSAT. So I ended up following in my sister's footsteps. She had gone to business school, so I took the GMAT and ended up going that route instead.
wow, awesome. So when, looking back on your career, when do you think you realized you were in the driver's seat for your career?
So it really was when I went to business school.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was living in New York. I was making $19,500 per year at the time, living
Seems
in
like a lot.
no, it did not, even then it didn't seem like a lot. I was in a small 3-bedroom with my brother and a friend of mine on the Upper East Side. The apartment was fantastic, but it was reasonably priced. So we actually didn't have a sink in the bathroom. You had to wash your hands in the kitchen sink. But we didn't care because it was in Manhattan. We were having a great time. We were exploring the city. But I said to myself, I cannot imagine going on along this path. How am I ever going to make enough money to
Mhm.
progress not only my career, but my personal life at that compensation level? So again, I had airfare benefits because I worked for Alitalia Airlines. My sister was going to business school in London at the time, at London Business School. So of course I took advantage of it and I went to see her, and she lived in this flat where it was I think 3 or 4 people on one floor, 3 or 4 people on another, and 3 or 4 people on the third. And I was so engaged by these people. It was a group of international students. They had all worked a little bit first before going back to grad school. The conversations were incredibly intellectual. They were such a great group of people. I said, okay, forget law school. I got to do this. I got to do this. But of course, I wanted to forge my own path. I couldn't copy my older sister. So I decided to go to the United States for an MBA. And that's when I said, okay, I am taking the bull by the horns and I will manage my career to achieve the goals that I want over time. And really from then on, I have mostly, not always, been in the driver's seat.
I love that. Where does that come from, though? That knowing, because still, when you're going to grad school, I remember going to grad school, there's some uncertainty about the end state and how you'll land or whatever. But there's this assuredness that's coming across to me like, I will be successful. Like, where does that come from?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Part of it is being the youngest of three. So I was always fiercely determined to be competitive with my siblings in the best possible way. Secondly, it really comes from growing up in a household where my dad was a recovered alcoholic.
Mhm.
So when we were young children, there was a ton of uncertainty. Now, he, thank God, with my mother's help, was able to stop drinking when I was a young teen. But that uncertainty sort of drives determination. because I didn't want that uncertainty for my own life. So I said, I am going to control my financial picture so that I don't have to worry. That's really where the drive came from.
Thank you for your authenticity on that. I appreciate that. So then as you look back on your career body of work, what's the secret sauce? What's your formula for successfully owning your career? What would you say?
Well, I think, the hard part is, as women, we are pulled in a bunch of different directions, right? We're pulled in wanting to be mothers and wanting, in some cases, to be a good partner. In other cases, to help our own parents and our own siblings. I mean, I feel like women are stereotypically and in reality caregivers, nurturers. So inevitably, I had always felt that if I focused too much on myself, I was being selfish. And I think what's important for women to understand is just because we focus on what we want, it doesn't make us selfish. It just makes us, I don't even know how to describe it, but good human beings that are contributors to society. It doesn't mean we have to do that to the exclusion of everything else. But what I try and counsel people now in particular is don't ever apologize for example, taking some time off to raise your children, or for needing a little bit of flexibility when your children are a certain age. That you should not apologize for that. We should say, okay, I have a good work ethic. I have good family values. This is the situation I'm in right now. How can we work around it? Now, in some cases, you have to work a little bit harder, than your average peer at work because you're trying to juggle a bunch of things, but it's temporary, right? Our children are not going to be young forever. So not only do we have to enjoy that time frame, but we also have to say, my career will evolve over time. And so the evolution of one's thought process, to me, is really what people need to embrace, and particularly women need to embrace. Don't apologize. Don't sell yourself short. As long as you have the work ethic, you'll be fine. And that doesn't mean you have to work like a crazy person, right? But you have to understand that there are certain times in your career where there's going to be a little bit more give and take than others. So now my kids, as I mentioned earlier, are in college. Now I have the pedal to the metal because I have the time to do that again.
Nice. So how do women get the right mindset? What are some tools and resources that you've experienced that's really helped you to have the right mindset to succeed?
Really, what has helped me over the years is being around like-minded people. And so some people have that, for example, from a sorority undergraduate. Some people have it from a mom's network. I'm talking about women, a mom's network in town. Some people have it from their work colleagues. My people really are the women and the men who I met at business school, because I feel like I can really be my authentic self with those people. And, a couple of weeks ago, I had a business trip down in Charlottesville, Virginia. A couple of my classmates, I went to Darden, which is University of Virginia's business school. So I stayed with them, and they're a husband and wife who met at Darden and then got married. And I feel like that week, I had so many great conversations. We understand each other. I could talk about work. I could talk about my personal life. And all I felt was support. So I think as women, we value that time with people. So it's important to find your key people and make sure that you give yourself time to be nurtured and to nurture outside of your family.
Yeah.
And outside of maybe your girlfriends, right? From a career perspective, you have to have that core group, in my opinion.
And so is it sometimes easier to find that group, because you're in that setting, that collegiate setting, or maybe you're just reading the room or taking advantage of opportunities where communities are thriving, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I had a very good group when I came out of business school. I was at Citibank and I was in the management associate program. And so there was a core group of us who went through about 2 years of training together. A lot of people, particularly in financial services where they have those sorts of corporate training programs, that's the group.
Yep.
that they end up sticking with. And especially as those people transition to other, companies, they still stick with that group. So from a career standpoint, it should be like-minded people in the kind of work that you want to do, but it doesn't necessarily have to be from school. It can be from anything. It can be a networking group.
Mm-hmm.
Women on Wall Street is a great example of, it's quite a big networking group, but the events themselves, encourage people to interact and keep that long-term relationship. So there's a lot of things like that. You just have to find what's going to work for you.
Yeah, let's continue on that train of thought. So for networking and building relationships, what have you found are strategies that work to build and nurture relationships? Because some of us in our, different styles, introverts, or some people are better at it than others. What are some things that you have found that's worked for you over the years?
Yeah, it's such a very good question, and I think it's a valid point. Some people are and maintaining those relationships, and it is not easy. I am an extrovert by nature, but sometimes if I'm going to an event, I really have to psych myself up, and I have to say, okay, I don't feel like talking to new people for the next 2 hours, but I just have to do it. You just have to fake it till you make it. And of course, I have 2 daughters who are in college, and this is what I'm telling me. They joke, they laugh every time we go to an event together, even if it's a social event. I always have business cards in my pocket. I know it's a little old-fashioned, but I personally don't like having to get my phone out and typing in a number. It's too cumbersome. I give someone my business card. Now, again, in my line of work, people are motivated to contact me back, and they generally do. But you have to figure out how to make sure that you can build that network. And of course, LinkedIn is a great, great way to do that, because you can keep in touch with people without having to get too involved in their lives. Okay, so that's the first thing. You have to find a way to be able to be confident in networking. The second thing really is to not only ask people for help, you have to also offer help. So this is, nothing new, but I get contacted by people all day, every day who need my help. I'm happy to do it, because in my line of work, it makes sense. However, that means if I call them for something, they can't ignore me. It's a little bit disrespectful. Not that they always have to get back to me. I don't necessarily need that, but a lot of people don't understand that there has to be a give and take. If you haven't talked to somebody in 3 years and then you call that person for help, at least take a little bit of a breath and say, how can I help you? How are you? What's happening with your work? What's happening with your family? How are things going? And then perhaps follow up with something helpful. So sometimes we get so transactional that we forget about the give and take in relationships. And of course, that's not only work, but that's also friendship.
Yes, that's right. Relationships. And I find that in mentoring. Sometimes I have mentees where it's a one-way pull, and I'm like, there's such a thing as reverse mentor. It's supposed to be a win-win. So I love what you said about the give and take, because yeah, it should be, how do we help each other, even if it's mentoring, and there's hierarchy differences. But I have had some experiences where it's just, what knowledge can I just siphon from you? And it's draining.
Yes. And you get tired of it.
Yeah.
If that's all the relationship is.
Yeah. And so
and especially I think with the pandemic, so much has become transactional because we're not in person as much.
Right. That word transactional doesn't feel warm.
No.
So when I think about networking, I move from the word networking to relationship building. So that helps me to reframe it and to show up, and be intentional about what relationships do I want to build when I go there. Let me at least meet one person and build a relation, at least one. I mean, I think about at least one, especially if I don't want to go. That's
yes. No, and like you and I met. Yeah, like you
Yes.
and I met at the WBDC event.
Yes, that was a wonderful event. I really enjoyed that. So fun. Yes, I'm better now about networking than I was then in my corporate days. I really dreaded it. But now I'm better. It's more fun for me now. So anyway.
Good, good.
Right. So relationships. So, what do you think about sponsors in your career? Some people get tripped up on the idea of mentors and sponsors. And what's been your experience around mentoring, receiving guidance from mentors, and how have sponsors showed up in your career to support you?
So really the word sponsors comes to mind with me in bigger corporate environments. So that means you, at least in my mind, you have a relationship with someone who is more senior, even if it's in a different department, and that person guides you through the corporate environment. So when I was at bigger companies like HSBC and Citibank, I had sponsors as well as mentors. But depending what kind of work you're in, you might not have a sponsor. If you're at a small company or a mid-sized company, it could be difficult to achieve that. And that's really where mentors come in, because the mentor can be in or out of the company. And really, it's good for people who are evolving in their careers to have somebody who can give objective advice. I remember early on in my career, somebody said to me, if you go to a work event, never have more than one drink. I don't care what happens. You never, ever, ever have more than one drink. It was the best advice ever, because you have to keep your head on straight. Again, in big corporate environments, it's very important to really do that. But there's, of course, millions and millions of guiding principles that people can share with you depending on the industry in which you're working. And to have people who are more experienced in your life is super helpful. Now, you might not always be able to appreciate the guidance or internalize it or really do anything about it, but over time it builds. And hopefully, in most cases, you're able to take that information and use it for your own career progression, even if you make a mistake and you realize the person was right and you didn't listen to the advice.
Well said. I love the nuance of the industry and how it might be different from a sponsor. As an entrepreneur now, but I do come from a corporate background, I do see the difference. I sort of reframe the sponsor tag as maybe a champion who pulls me into an organization or opens the door for me. I look at the sponsor now that way, which is different. So yeah,
Yes.
the industry matters, and more so in the corporate space as well. I would agree with that. So tell me, as you look back on your career body of work, if you were to write a book, which defines your career, what do you think the title would be?
I think everyone's title is going to be different, right? For me, and I give a lot of advice to people. I give a lot of advice to my daughters and their friends who, they're in college. So I would say my title would be have courage and be resilient. Not be afraid to be courageous, but not everything's always going to work out. So if you fall down, you have to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and move on. It's not the end of the world. Before somebody has been fired at some point in his or her life, it's really hard when they have to go through that. And I coach a lot of people, of course, now who have been fired for the first time. It's okay. You will get through it. Resiliency is key.
It definitely is. And, sometimes it's, not even as drastic as the firing. It could be making the decision to change course and move from the familiarity. And you're stuck in that because it's so comfortable. I know that well. You're stuck in it because it's so comfortable. So how do you look at risk? How do you, what goes through your mind when you decide to take a risk in your career? What should people consider?
Well, what I like to talk to a lot of people about is something that I did in my second year of graduate school. It was a course that I took. It was called career management, but it was so much more than that. And as part of that process, we in pairs prepared what our life would look like when we were retired. And I'm putting that in quotes because retirement could mean anything, right?
Mhm.
It can be, I'm never going to retire. I'm still going to work until the day I drop dead at my desk, or I want to stop working full time at the age of 45, whatever it is.
Mhm.
But what we did as part of that process is we said, okay, let's define our life. So for me, okay, how much money do I want in the bank? At what age? What does my family situation look like? How much do I want to travel? Where do I want to live? And you create this picture across different aspects of your life, and you work backwards in 5 or 10 years. And a matter of fact, you should look at that periodically to say, is this still my goal?
Mhm.
The issue that it raises is, what risks am I willing to take to achieve my goal?
Mm.
And so for me, growing up with a little bit of financial instability, financial stability was very important for me. And so if I had money in the bank, I was actually a lot more flexible about the career path that
Mm.
I took. For some people, for example, if they have a trust fund, their risks are different. Or if somebody has a very low key lifestyle and they don't actually enjoy travel, they don't necessarily need to buy a nice car, they're living in an area of the country potentially where the cost of living is lower, having money in the bank maybe is going to be easier for them, or a lower volume, so you have to figure out, what are your goals
Yep.
and what are you willing to risk, right? So I've moved around a lot. I've changed jobs. I've changed careers because my goals were different. It was about having, a close-knit family, taking care of my daughters. And as long as I had some money in the bank, it gave me the wherewithal to be able to take these other risks.
Mhm.
But not everybody has that luxury. You have to see where your life is and what risks you can take.
Yeah.
Sometimes the risk is simply, I'm going to change from one stable job to another because the commute is shorter. That's a risk for
Mhm.
some people. And so you just have to define what you want and then evaluate your personal risks, and try not to, try and keep up with other people if that's not what you want to do. Because I like to tell my daughters, there's always going to be somebody who's more successful, richer than you, more beautiful than you are. I mean, you can't compare yourselves to other people.
Yeah.
Life is too short to do that.
Yes, I agree. I just read something on LinkedIn about teenagers comparing themselves and the damage that social media is doing. And I think, platforms, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, or even LinkedIn, I think there is some comparison there based on the postings that are coming about. So you do have to be well grounded to recognize what you bring to the table and your uniqueness. I agree with
Right.
you.
And
Mhm.
your goals might be different
That's
than other
right.
people.
That's
So,
right.
and that's okay. That's okay.
I love the idea of thinking about risk differently. What was coming up for me while you were talking was the Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind, just, work your way backwards. And then I was thinking of Maslow's hierarchy and what's important, like all these different things are popping into my head. I love that. Thank you for sharing
Good.
your wisdom with our audience. Any parting words as we begin to wrap the interview?
Well, I just like it when people support each other. And, when I met you, Simone, at the WBDC event, I was like, wow, this is going to be a person who I want to keep in touch with. And I think we should all look out for people like that in
Mhm.
our lives. And if you feel inspiration from somebody, go ahead, give that person your information, take that person's information in return. Even if you talk to them once every 5 years,
Yep.
that is healthy. It's good. Let's keep in touch with the people who we feel like are doing interesting, innovative things that can then help us in our own careers. Don't be so shy that it prevents you from doing that. That's the parting advice I'd give people.
It feels organic. I love that. And thank you for saying yes. You have so much to share with the audience, so much good stuff. Rebecca, can you tell our audience how they could stay connected with you if they'd like to do so?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. My email and my phone number are there. It's Rebecca Wilson at 2020 Foresight Executive Search. Feel free to email me, rwilson at 2020-4.com as well.
Awesome. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for being a guest on the Power of Owning Your Career podcast.
Thank you too. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this week's empowering career story on the podcast. If you did, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. Wherever you listen to the podcast, be sure that you are subscribing and that you rate and review the podcast. It's so important as we continue to spread the word of career empowerment. In addition, you can head over to the LinkedIn platform and join the Power of Owning Your Career discussion group. There you can have access to the guests who have been on the podcast, as well as others listening to the podcast, as well as myself, where we can continue the conversation. I hope to see you on that platform. You can also email me at pooyc@simonemorris.com if you have a suggestion for guest or a message that you want me to hear personally. Thanks so much, and make it an inspiring, empowering week in your career.